single dad rescues an elderly lady, not knowing she's a secret millionaire who owns half the city. Greetings from Heart Story HQ. Before we begin, let us know in the comments what part of the world you're joining us from. We hope you enjoy the story. William grew up in the modest town of Fairview, a place where the rhythm of life moved slowly, dictated by the hum of factory machines and the toll of church bells on Sundays. It was a town where everyone knew your name and every decision you made seemed to echo in the chatter of neighbors. William was the youngest of 3 boys, but unlike his boisterous brothers, he was quieter, more observant. He spent hours in his father's garage, captivated by the clink of tools and the low murmur of the radio his father kept tuned to old country songs. William's father, Martin, was a mechanic, known around town for his uncanny ability to coax life back into even the most hopeless vehicles. Martin wasn't just fixing cars, he was helping families get back on their feet, ensuring people could make it to work, take their kids to school, and hold their lives together. William admired his father deeply and spent countless evenings watching him work, absorbing not just the mechanics but the quiet pride his father took in helping others. By the time William was in his teens, he could take apart an engine and put it back together with ease. He worked alongside his father after school, their bond growing stronger with every wrench turned. But life wasn't easy in Fairview. The economy was fragile and opportunities were scarce. Despite their hard work, the family often scraped by, teaching William the value of resilience and determination. William's life took a hopeful and unexpected turn in his early 20s when he met Emma, a kind and spirited woman who worked at the local library. She wasn't someone who sought attention or commanded a room, but she had a quiet radiance about her, a way of making people feel seen and understood in a way that was rare. Emma had a knack for remembering small details about people's lives, the names of their pets, their favorite books, or the struggles they hinted at but never fully shared. William first met her on a rainy afternoon when he ducked into the library to avoid a sudden downpour. She was sitting behind the front desk, sorting through a cart of books with an easy grace. When she looked up and greeted him with a warm smile, it was as if the grayness of the day had lifted. She teased him about dripping water all over the carpet and handed him a towel from behind the counter. That small moment of kindness led to a conversation that stretched on for hours. They talked about everything from their favorite childhood books to their dreams for the future. For William, who had spent most of his life focused on work and family responsibilities, Emma was a breath of fresh air. Their courtship was simple but deeply meaningful. Emma had a love for the outdoors, and their dates often consisted of long walks through the local park, hand in hand as they talked about their hopes and fears. William would take her to his favorite diner, a humble spot that served the best pie in town, and she'd always insist on ordering cherry pie, her favorite. They'd laugh about the most trivial things: an overexcited dog chasing its tail in the park, a mismatched pair of socks William accidentally wore one day. With Emma, life felt lighter. It didn't take long for William to realize that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. They married within a year, a small ceremony held in the backyard of Emma's childhood home. And the day was filled with laughter and love, a gathering of close friends and family who celebrated not just the union of 2 people, but the beginning of a life built on shared values and unwavering support. Emma's mother had baked the wedding cake, and William's father gave a toast that brought everyone to tears, speaking about how proud he was of the man William had become. Shortly after their wedding, they welcomed Evelyn into the world. She was a tiny, delicate baby with her mother's eyes and a laugh that seemed to brighten even the darkest days. For William, holding his daughter for the first time was a moment he'd never forget. He felt an overwhelming sense of purpose, a determination to give Evelyn and Emma the best life he could. The next 2 years were a whirlwind of happiness. Family dinners, late-night feedings, and watching Evelyn take her first wobbly steps. Life was far from perfect, but it was theirs, and it was enough. But that happiness was cruelly cut short. When Evelyn was just 2 years old, Emma began experiencing persistent fatigue and unexplained pain. What they initially dismissed as stress turned out to be something far more serious. The day the doctor uttered the word cancer, William felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. Emma was diagnosed with an aggressive form of the disease, and the prognosis was bleak. The months that followed were some of the hardest of William's life. Their days became a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, and moments of quiet desperation. William watched helplessly as Emma's vibrant energy faded. The woman who once laughed so easily and made everyone around her feel special was now confined to a hospital bed, fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win. William did everything he could to hold their lives together. He said, "We sat in the front room of the house together when I was younger and felt sorry for you." He juggled his job at the auto repair shop with caring for Evelyn and supporting Emma. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford. Late at night, after Evelyn had been tucked into bed and the house had fallen silent, William would sit at the kitchen table staring at a stack of unpaid bills. The weight of their financial struggles was crushing, but it paled in comparison to the emotional toll of watching Emma suffer. Despite the pain, Emma remained a source of strength for William. Even in her weakest moments, she would reach for his hand and whisper words of encouragement, telling him to stay strong for Evelyn. She worried more about the two of them than she did about herself, and that selflessness broke William's heart. When Emma passed away, the void she left was immeasurable. William was left alone with a toddler and a mountain of debt that seemed insurmountable. The garage he had inherited from his father, a place filled with memories and a sense of purpose, had to be sold to cover the medical bills. Losing the garage felt like losing a piece of himself, but he had no choice. William found work at a small auto repair shop on the edge of town, a far cry from the independence he once had. Life became a delicate balancing act. Long hours at the shop, late nights caring for Evelyn, and the constant pressure of making ends meet. The grief of losing Emma never fully went away, but he buried it deep, focusing all his energy on giving Evelyn the life Emma would have wanted for her. Every decision he made revolved around Evelyn. He'd wake up early to make her pancakes shaped like hearts, even if it meant skipping breakfast himself. He'd stay up late sewing buttons onto her favorite dress or repairing a toy she refused to part with. Evelyn became his anchor, his reason for pushing forward despite the overwhelming odds. But as much as he tried to shield her from the struggles, as she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly when he counted out cash at the grocery store. She never said much about it, but in her own way she tried to lift his spirits. A drawing taped to the fridge, a quick hug when he least expected it, or a simple, "I love you, Daddy." For William, those small moments of joy were enough to keep him going, even when the weight of the world seemed unbearable. Yet, no matter how hard he worked, the future remained uncertain. His landlord had grown impatient, issuing an ultimatum to pay the overdue rent or face eviction. The walls seemed to be closing in, but William refused to give up. He had lost Emma, but he wouldn't lose the life he was trying to build for Evelyn. Little did William know, his encounter with Ava on that stormy night would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about struggle, kindness, and the power of second chances. Ava's journey began in the cramped confines of a two-room apartment in Chicago during the toughest years of the Great Depression. The world around her seemed shrouded in gray. Factories belching smoke, lines of people waiting for bread, and a constant undercurrent of desperation in the air. Her father worked long hours in a steel mill, coming home covered in soot and exhaustion, while her mother took in mending and laundry to make ends meet. There were 5 children in the household, and Ava, the eldest, felt the weight of responsibility early. At the tender age of 12, she began taking on odd jobs. She delivered newspapers, scrubbed floors, and sewed buttons onto coats in a neighborhood tailor's shop. Ava quickly learned how to stretch a dollar, turning scraps into meals and making hand-me-down clothes look new. Despite the hardships, she was resourceful and determined, her sharp mind and quick wit setting her apart from her peers. She dreamed of a better life, one where her family wouldn't have to choose between paying the rent and putting food on the table. By the time Ava was 18, she was supporting her younger siblings and helping her parents pay off lingering debts. Her hard work earned her a reputation in the neighborhood as a problem solver, someone who could figure out how to fix almost anything, whether it was a broken window or a friend's dwindling savings. But Ava wasn't content to stay within the narrow confines of her community. She wanted more, not just for herself, but for her family. When Ava was in her early 20s, she met Charles Bennett, a man whose charm and ambition were impossible to ignore. They first crossed paths at a local community event organized to discuss revitalizing struggling neighborhoods in Chicago. Charles, then a young real estate agent, stood out from the crowd, not because of his appearance or wealth, but because of his ability to inspire. He spoke passionately about the untapped potential in overlooked properties and the importance of reinvesting in communities. Ava, who had spent her life working hard for every penny, found his optimism both intriguing and refreshing. Charles wasn't wealthy when they met. In fact, he had more debt than assets, a struggling portfolio, and a car that barely started on cold mornings. But what he lacked in financial stability, he made up for in vision. Charles had a gift for seeing possibilities where others saw problems. To him, a crumbling building wasn't an eyesore, it was an opportunity waiting to be unlocked. He had a way of painting pictures with his words, describing how run-down apartments could become thriving homes and empty lots could transform into bustling community hubs. Ava was drawn to his vision, but what truly captivated her was his genuine belief in hard work and his refusal to take shortcuts. For Charles, success wasn't just about money, it was about creating something meaningful. On the other hand, Charles was equally captivated by Ava's resilience. She had grown up in a world where nothing came easily, and that grit showed in everything she did. She had a sharp mind, a keen sense of practicality, and an unshakable determination to overcome any obstacle. Their bond grew quickly, and before long they realized they were not just kindred spirits but also partners who could complement each other's strengths. Charles had the big ideas and the charisma to sell them, while Ava had the resourcefulness and work ethic to bring those ideas to life. Together they decided to take a leap of faith. They would go into business as partners. Their beginnings were humble. With a small loan from Charles's uncle and every dollar they could scrape together, they bought their first property. A dilapidated two-story house in a neighborhood most people had written off. The house had broken windows, peeling paint, and a sagging roof, but Ava and Charles saw its potential. They spent long nights working side by side, scrubbing floors, repainting walls, and repairing everything from plumbing to wiring. They couldn't afford to hire contractors, so they learned to do the work themselves. That first project tested their patience and their relationship. There were moments of exhaustion and frustration. Charles handled the negotiations and financing, while Ava managed the logistics and design. She had an eye for detail that could turn even the most uninviting property into something special. Ava would walk into a room and immediately see what it needed: a splash of color, better lighting, or a small structural change that would make the space more functional. As word of their work spread, opportunities began to come their way. They started flipping larger properties and eventually moved into commercial real estate, turning vacant lots into retail spaces and community centers. Ava and Charles didn't just focus on profit, they cared about the people who lived and worked in the neighborhoods they revitalized. They made it a point to hire local workers and collaborate with community leaders to ensure their projects met real needs. Their business grew steadily, and so did their reputation. Charles became known as a visionary, while Ava earned a reputation as the meticulous, detail-oriented force behind the scenes. Together, they built an empire, transforming neglected parts of the city into vibrant, thriving communities. But their success came at a cost. Charles was a relentless worker, often putting in 14-hour days to ensure deals closed smoothly and projects stayed on track. He had a magnetic personality that drew people in, but it also meant he was constantly in demand. Ava, too, found herself consumed by the demands of their growing business. She managed multiple projects at once, often sacrificing sleep and personal time to ensure deadlines were met and budgets stayed intact. Though they had planned to start a family, the years slipped by in a blur of meetings, construction schedules, and financial reports. They often spoke of having children someday, but someday never seemed to come. Weekends that were supposed to be spent relaxing turned into site visits, and dinners at home were often replaced by late-night takeout in the office. There were times when Ava missed the simplicity of their early days, when their work felt more personal and their time together wasn't overshadowed by stress. She would occasionally catch Charles staring wistfully at old photos of their first projects, and she knew he felt it too, the sense that they had traded a piece of their happiness for their success. Still, neither of them voiced these feelings openly. They were partners in every sense of the word, and they believed that the sacrifices they were making were necessary for the future they were building together. Ava took comfort in the knowledge that their work wasn't just about making money, it was about leaving a legacy, something that would outlast them both. By the time they reached their 40s, Charles and Ava were no longer just business partners, they were a powerhouse. Their company was one of the most successful real estate firms in the city, and their projects had transformed countless neighborhoods. Yet, for all their achievements, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was a thought she kept to herself, quietly tucked away, as she continued to focus on building the life she and Charles had envisioned. However, the fast-paced success took a toll on Charles's health. The long hours, constant travel, and unyielding stress began to show. Ava urged him to slow down, but Charles, ever the optimist, would brush off her concerns with a laugh, saying, "We're building something that will last forever, Ava. We can rest when we're done." Tragedy struck unexpectedly one quiet autumn morning. Charles collapsed in his office, clutching his chest. By the time Ava arrived at the hospital, it was too late. A heart attack had claimed him, leaving Ava devastated and alone in the empire they had built together. For weeks, Ava barely left the house. The once vibrant woman who could spot potential in the bleakest of places now struggled to find purpose in her day-to-day life. The silence of their sprawling home was unbearable, and the weight of her grief felt suffocating. As the months passed, Ava threw herself into her work, partly as a distraction and partly as a way to honor Charles's legacy. Yet, as she attended meetings and oversaw projects, she couldn't ignore the emptiness that lingered. Their success had come at a cost, and it became increasingly clear to Ava that her life had been consumed by ambition. Her relationship with her family was strained. She had distanced herself from her siblings in pursuit of her career, and her nephews and nieces barely knew her. Attempts to reconcile with them were often met with polite indifference or thinly veiled resentment. Her wealth, once a symbol of achievement, now felt like a barrier between her and genuine human connection. Determined to rediscover meaning, Ava began living modestly, retreating from the public eye. She sold their grand home and moved into a small, unassuming apartment. She spent her days walking the city streets, blending in with the crowds, observing the lives of ordinary people. These quiet moments reminded her of her roots, of the times when every dollar counted and community meant everything. Over time, Ava developed a habit of engaging with strangers in unexpected ways. She'd help a struggling family pay their grocery bill, anonymously cover the tuition of a bright student, or leave generous tips for hardworking servers. Each act of kindness was a step toward healing, a way to reconnect with the values that had shaped her life. It was during one of these quiet outings that Ava found herself on the side of the road, her car sputtering to a halt in the middle of a storm. She had intended to visit an old neighborhood she and Charles had revitalized years ago, but hadn't expected the journey to leave her stranded. As the rain poured down, soaking her through, Ava couldn't help but reflect on the irony of her situation. For all her wealth and resources, she was now utterly dependent on the kindness of a stranger. Little did she know, that stranger would be William, and their chance encounter would change both of their lives forever. The storm showed no signs of letting up as William stepped out of his truck, the rain instantly drenching him. His jacket, thin and worn from years of use, clung to his frame as the cold seeped through to his skin. He pulled it tighter, his boots squelching against the muddy shoulder of the road. The elderly woman standing beside her stranded car looked small and frail against the backdrop of the storm. She was huddled under a wide-brimmed hat that did little to shield her from the downpour. Water dripped from its edges onto her coat, which hung heavily from the weight of the rain. "Ma'am," William called out, his voice barely cutting through the roar of the storm. "Do you need some help?" The woman turned toward him, her face partially obscured by the shadow of her hat. Her eyes, though tired, held a sharpness that seemed out of place for someone in her position. She hesitated before answering, as though weighing whether to trust him. "The car just stopped," she said, her voice trembling. Not from fear, but from the chill that seemed to grip her. "I don't know what happened. I didn't know who else to call." William nodded, already stepping toward the car. "Let me take a look." As he popped the hood, a cloud of steam hissed out, the smell of overheated metal mingling with the rain. He grabbed a flashlight from his truck and leaned over the engine, his hands moving with practiced ease despite the numbness creeping into his fingers. The woman watched him intently, standing a few feet behind him. She clutched her soaked coat tightly around herself, her eyes flicking between William and his truck, where the faint glow of a small light illuminated a child's silhouette. "Your daughter?" the woman asked, her voice cutting through the sound of the storm. William glanced back briefly, a soft smile breaking through the tension on his face. "Yeah, Evelyn, she's 8. "She's patient," the woman observed, nodding toward the truck. "She has to be," William replied, turning back to the engine. "It's just the two of us. She's learned how to roll with the punches." The woman said nothing, but her gaze lingered on the truck, her expression unreadable. There was something about the way she stood there, as though she were absorbing every detail of the moment, weighing it in some invisible balance. Minutes passed as William worked, his focus unwavering despite the storm. He muttered under his breath, occasionally wiping rain from his eyes with the back of his hand. Finally, the engine sputtered to life, a low rumble that cut through the night. "There we go," William said, stepping back and closing the hood. He turned to the woman, his expression calm despite the chill that had turned his face pale. "Should be good to go now. You'll want to get the radiator checked though, it's running hot." The woman looked at him as though he'd just performed a miracle. Relief washed over her face, softening the lines that worry and age had etched into her features. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with sincerity. "Thank you so much." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill, extending it toward him. "Please, take this." William shook his head, raising a hand to refuse. "No need, ma'am. Kindness doesn't come with a price tag." "You're a good man," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not many would stop on a night like this." William offered a small, self-conscious smile, tipping the brim of his hat. "Just doing what I'd hope someone would do for me." As he turned to head back to his truck, the woman called out, "What's your name?" "William," he said over his shoulder. "William Carter." She nodded, repeating his name under her breath as though committing it to memory. "And your daughter?" "Evelyn?" he said, glancing back toward the truck. Evelyn had pressed her face against the window, watching the exchange with wide eyes. The woman gave a small smile, a hint of warmth breaking through her otherwise stoic demeanor. "You two take care, William." "You too, ma'am," he replied, climbing back into his truck. The heater blasted warm air against his chilled skin as he closed the door, the sound of the storm muffled once more. "Who was that, Dad?" Evelyn asked, her voice groggy but curious. "Just someone who needed a little help," William said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. He started the truck and pulled back onto the road, the headlights cutting through the rain. As they drove away, William caught one last glimpse of the woman in his mirror. She stood on the side of the road, her car idling now, watching them with an expression that William couldn't quite place. It wasn't gratitude, though that was part of it. It was something deeper, something searching. Long after William's truck disappeared into the night, Ava remained where she stood, the rain soaking her to the bone. Her thoughts were a storm of their own, swirling with the unexpected kindness she had just experienced. It wasn't the act itself that struck her. People had been kind to her before. It was the way William had done it, without hesitation, without expectation, without even considering the inconvenience to himself. She thought about the little girl in the truck, bundled up with her teddy bear and nightlight. There was a quiet resilience in the way she had waited, the same resilience Ava had seen in children who had grown up with less. It tugged at something deep within her, a memory she couldn't quite name. As she climbed back into her car, her hands trembling against the steering wheel, Ava made a decision. William Carter wasn't just another passerby, and this wasn't just another fleeting encounter. There was something about him. Something she needed to understand. Ava had spent years watching people, searching for authenticity in a world that often felt hollow. She had seen kindness before, but rarely had she seen it so pure, so untainted by self-interest. She couldn't ignore it, and she wouldn't. Pulling back onto the road, Ava's mind was already working. Who was this man who had stopped for a stranger in the middle of a storm? What kind of life had shaped him into someone who would help without asking for anything in return? And most importantly, how could she repay him? not just for fixing her car, but for reminding her that people like him still existed. Ava would make sure of it. A few days after the storm, William was busy under the hood of a rusted sedan at the auto repair shop where he worked. The air was filled with the familiar scent of grease and engine oil, the clatter of tools punctuating the hum of an old radio playing in the corner. William's hands moved with precision, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of unpaid bills and Evelyn's upcoming school recital. The sound of a car pulling into the lot drew his attention. He glanced up and froze. It was the woman from the storm. She stepped out of her car, a modest but well-kept sedan, and offered a small wave, her expression warm but reserved. "William, isn't it?" she asked as she approached. He wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "That's me." "Didn't expect to see you again, ma'am." "Ava," she corrected with a faint smile. "And, well, my car's been acting up again. I thought you might be able to take another look." William raised an eyebrow but nodded, gesturing toward an open bay. "Pull it in and I'll see what's going on." As Ava drove the car into the shop, she couldn't help but glance around. The place was small and worn, with tools scattered across workbenches and a few patched-up chairs in the waiting area. It wasn't much, but it was clear William took pride in his work. Over the next hour, William inspected her car while Ava sat nearby, striking up a conversation. She asked about his work, his life, and his daughter. William answered politely but kept his responses brief, clearly not one to open up easily. "She must be something special," Ava said, her tone warm as she glanced at a framed drawing hanging on the wall, a crayon sketch of a car with the words, "Daddy's the best mechanic," written in a child's handwriting. William couldn't help but smile. "She is. Evelyn's my whole world." As the days turned into weeks, Ava began visiting the shop more frequently, each time with a different excuse. A noise her car was making, a light that wouldn't turn off, or just to say thank you again for his kindness. Her visits started to feel less like errands and more like something deliberate, though William never said anything about it. He simply accepted her presence with the quiet grace that defined him. One Saturday afternoon, Ava showed up at the shop carrying a small stack of books. "I thought Evelyn might like these," she said, handing them to William. "I used to read them to my nephews when they were her age." William hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Ava said simply, "but I wanted to." Later that evening, when William brought the books home, Evelyn's eyes lit up. She flipped through the pages eagerly, her excitement filling their small apartment with warmth. The next time Ava visited the shop, Evelyn was there, sitting in a corner with her teddy bear. Ava approached her gently, kneeling to meet her eye level. "Hi there, Evelyn. Do you like the books?" Evelyn nodded shyly. "The one about the bunny is my favorite." "Well, I have a few more at home. Maybe I could bring them next time." From that moment, a bond began to form between Ava and Evelyn. Ava would bring more books, sometimes reading them aloud to Evelyn while William worked. She shared stories from her own childhood, teaching Evelyn little lessons about kindness, resilience, and the importance of family. Evelyn, in turn, began calling her Grandma Ava, a title that surprised and deeply moved Ava. Ava witnessed the strain William was under. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of his responsibilities. She also saw the heartbreak in Evelyn's face when she mentioned her father missing her recital. That night, as Ava sat alone in her modest apartment, she found herself thinking about her own children. She had always believed she was building a better future for them, but in doing so, she had missed countless recitals, birthdays, and moments that couldn't be replaced. Her children had grown distant, their relationships with her defined more by transactions than affection. For the first time in years, Ava allowed herself to cry. She saw in William the parent she had failed to be, a man who gave everything he had, even when it left him with nothing. And she saw in Evelyn the child she had longed to reconnect with but never could. It was clear to Ava now. William and Evelyn were more than just strangers who had crossed her path. They were her chance at redemption, a way to make things right, not with her own family, but with a family that truly deserved it. Ava resolved to do more than just observe. She would help William and Evelyn in any way she could, not out of pity, but out of genuine respect for the life they were trying to build. She didn't yet know how she would achieve it, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going to let them face their struggles alone. William had always trusted his instincts, but something about what he saw left a knot in his stomach. It was a brisk afternoon, and he was returning from the grocery store when he spotted Ava stepping out of a sleek black car parked near one of the city's most luxurious buildings. She was dressed simply, as always, but the car and the setting didn't match the modest image she had presented. For a moment, he thought there must be a mistake. But as he watched her greet the doorman, who addressed her with a respectful nod and opened the door for her, the pieces began to fall into place. Ava wasn't just the kind elderly woman he'd met during a storm. She was someone important, someone with access to wealth and privilege that she had carefully concealed. The sight left him feeling betrayed. All those visits, the quiet moments she had spent reading to Evelyn, the conversations that had felt so genuine, they all seemed tainted now. Was she using them for some personal agenda? Was he just another project for someone who pitied him? That evening, as Ava arrived at the shop to bring Evelyn another book, William didn't bother hiding his frustration. He met her at the door, his expression hard. "You could have just told me," he said, his voice tight. Ava tilted her head, confused. "Told you what?" "About who you really are," he snapped, gesturing toward her. "The car, the fancy building. You're not some ordinary woman who needs help with her car. You've been lying to me." Ava's face fell. The warmth in her eyes replaced with something sadder, deeper. She took a moment to gather her thoughts before replying. "William, sometimes people hide who they are to see the world as it truly is." "What's that supposed to mean?" he shot back, his frustration bubbling over. "That you've been pretending to be one of us, watching me struggle like it's some kind of social experiment?" "No," she said firmly, her voice quiet but steady. "I've been trying to understand. To see what I've missed all these years, and to see if people like you still exist." William shook his head, the weight of his struggles making it hard to process her words. "Well, congratulations, you've seen it. Now you can go back to your world, and I'll stay in mine." Ava's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she looked as though she might cry. But she didn't argue. She simply nodded and left, her steps slow and deliberate as she disappeared into the night. The days that followed were some of the darkest of William's life. Whispers began spreading throughout the neighborhood. It started small. Comments made to other tenants, hints dropped at the local diner. By the time the rumors reached William's workplace, they had grown into outright accusations. William was in deep debt, unreliable with money, and even suspected of stealing from his employer. None of it was true, but truth had little weight against the momentum of gossip. At the auto repair shop where William worked, the pressure had been mounting for months. Business was slow, and the owner, Mr. Bradley, had been quietly considering downsizing. The rumors about William gave him the excuse he needed. "William," Mr. Bradley said one Friday afternoon, calling him into the office. The tone of his voice was unsettlingly kind, like someone delivering bad news they didn't want to give. "I've been hearing some things, and with the shop's financial situation being what it is, I think it's best if we part ways." William stared at him, stunned. "You know me, Mr. Bradley? You know none of that's true." Mr. Bradley sighed, looking down at his desk to avoid William's gaze. "I know, but this isn't personal, it's business." William clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he fought to hold back his anger. But what good would anger do? He needed the job more than ever, and yet he was being let go based on lies he had no way of disproving. Without the steady income from the shop, everything began to crumble. The eviction notices, already a familiar presence on the kitchen counter, became more frequent and urgent. Each letter felt heavier than the last, a reminder of the life slipping through his fingers. Desperate, William began selling whatever he could to buy himself more time. First, it was small things: an old radio that had belonged to his father, a box of tools he had held onto as a connection to the garage he'd grown up in. Then came the harder decisions. Evelyn's childhood stroller, which he had kept as a sentimental reminder of her earliest years, was sold to a neighbor for a fraction of what it was worth. Every sale felt like a piece of himself was being stripped away, leaving behind a hollow shell. The apartment, once modest but full of life, began to look barren. Boxes were stacked in every corner, the few belongings they had left packed away in preparation for the inevitable. William tried to shield Evelyn from the worst of it, putting on a brave face whenever she asked questions. But even an 8-year-old could sense the tension in the air. One evening, as William packed up the last of their belongings, Evelyn sat on the floor in the living room, hugging her teddy bear tightly. The room felt unnaturally quiet without the sound of her laughter or the hum of the old radio that had once played softly in the background. Evelyn hadn't said much that day, and her silence gnawed at William's already raw nerves. Finally, she looked up at him, her big eyes filled with a mix of confusion and sadness. "Where are we going, Dad?" she asked, her voice small and hesitant. William paused, the words catching in his throat. How could he explain to her that they had nowhere to go, that the only option left was a shelter where he couldn't promise her the comfort or stability she deserved? He forced a smile, though it felt as fragile as the life they were leaving behind, to a new place. He had to hold it together for her. That night, as Evelyn fell asleep on the bare mattress that would soon be left behind, William sat at the kitchen table, staring at the eviction notice in his hand. The weight of it all pressed down on him, suffocating and inescapable. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry, his silent sobs breaking the oppressive stillness of the apartment. In the back of his mind, he thought of Ava. Part of him wanted to blame her for everything, her visits, her presence in their lives, and the chain of events that had led to this moment. But another part of him, the quieter part, couldn't shake the memory of her kindness. It was a confusing tangle of emotions that he didn't have the energy to untangle. All he knew was that he had reached the end of his rope, and as the dawn broke the next morning, casting pale light over the packed boxes and empty walls, William felt like a man standing on the edge of an abyss, unsure if there was anything left to hold on to. The knock on the door came late that night, just as William was taping up the last box. The sound startled him. Visitors were rare, especially at this hour. For a moment, he thought it might be the landlord, eager to push him out before the eviction deadline. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and opened the door. Ava stood there, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. She looked different, not in her usual modest appearance, but in the quiet strength radiating from her. She wasn't carrying the gentle warmth she usually brought during her visits. Tonight there was something unshakable in her gaze, a determination that made William pause. "I heard what happened," she said softly, her voice tinged with both regret and resolve. "May I come in?" William hesitated. He glanced back at the nearly empty apartment, an echo of the life he had tried to build, and then at Ava. Reluctantly, he stepped aside, gesturing toward the barren living room. Not much left to see. Ava stepped inside, her eyes sweeping over the stacked boxes, the sparse furniture, and the small pile of Evelyn's toys in the corner. Her gaze lingered on a single stuffed bear resting atop the boxes, its fur worn and its stitching coming undone. She sighed, the weight of the scene settling on her shoulders. She turned to face William, her expression grave. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." William's brow furrowed. "Another secret?" he asked bitterly, crossing his arms in a defensive stance. "Yes," Ava admitted, her voice steady and calm. She met his gaze head-on, refusing to flinch under his frustration. "But it's not what you think." William's eyes narrowed, his frustration barely contained. "Let me guess. You're not actually who you said you were. What is it this time? Another layer to the story?" Ava stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "I'm not just Ava, the woman you helped during a storm," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm Ava Bennett. I own this building, and about half the city." For a moment there was silence. William's jaw tightened, his expression hardening into a mask of disbelief and anger. "And you didn't think to mention that when you were visiting me? When you sat in my shop and acted like you cared about me and Evelyn? I didn't want you to see me as anything other than a person," Ava explained, her voice laced with quiet urgency. "Do you know what it's like to be surrounded by people who only care about what you have? People who see your money but never you? With you, it was different. That night on the road, you stopped to help me without asking who I was or what I could give you. You didn't treat me like I was anyone special. You just helped because it was the right thing to do." William shook his head, his emotions bubbling to the surface. "So what now? You're here to pity me? To throw some money at me and call it charity? This is a deed to a property on the other side of town. It's small, but it's safe and clean. It's yours, a place for you and Evelyn to start over." William stared at the paper, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why would you do this for us?" Ava stepped closer, her voice softening. "Because you gave me something I didn't think I'd ever find again. You reminded me that kindness still exists, that people can still be good, even when the world hasn't been kind to them. You showed me something I'd lost faith in, and I can't just walk away knowing you're struggling." William shook his head, his pride warring with his desperation. "I can't accept this. It's too much. I don't want your handouts." "This isn't charity," Ava said, her tone firm but compassionate. "It's kindness repaid. And this isn't just about you, William. It's about Evelyn. She deserves more than this. She deserves a chance at the life you're trying so hard to give her." William's resolve began to crack. He looked at Ava, at the unwavering sincerity in her eyes, and then at the deed in her hand. The weight of his pride was heavy, but not as heavy as the burden of failing his daughter. Tears welled in his eyes, and he quickly wiped them away, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Ava said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "By reminding me what truly matters. You don't have to do this alone anymore, William. Let me help." For the first time in weeks, the suffocating weight on William's chest began to lift. He took the deed from her hand, his fingers trembling, and nodded. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Ava smiled, a small but genuine smile that spoke of relief and hope. "This is just the beginning," she said softly, "for both of us." In that moment, an unspoken promise passed between them. They were no longer two strangers connected by a single act of kindness. They were partners in rebuilding something greater. The first morning in their new home was surreal for William and Evelyn. The small house wasn't lavish, but it was warm, clean, and filled with light. An undeniable contrast to the cold, cramped apartment they had left behind. Evelyn squealed with delight as she explored the backyard, her teddy bear tucked under one arm. For the first time in months, William felt like he could breathe. Ava's offer had come with an opportunity, a chance for William to manage several of her rental properties. The properties were modest, many of them in neighborhoods that reminded William of Fairview, the town he grew up in. At first, William hesitated, unsure if he could handle such a responsibility. But Ava's confidence in him never wavered. "You know what it's like to struggle," Ava had said during one of their conversations. "That's exactly why you'll succeed. These tenants need someone who cares, someone who sees them as more than just rent checks." True to her word, Ava gave William full autonomy to manage the properties as he saw fit. He approached the job with the same diligence and honesty that had defined his work as a mechanic. He got to know the tenants personally, learning their names, their stories, and their struggles. Through when pipes burst or heating broke, William was there, often with Evelyn tagging along, carrying her tiny toolbox filled with toy tools. As William's confidence grew, so did his ambitions. Inspired by Ava's kindness and the sense of purpose his new job gave him, he started a community outreach program. Using a portion of the funds Ava provided, he organized free repair workshops for families in need. Cars were fixed, homes were patched up, and lives were quietly but profoundly improved. Word of William's program spread, and soon other local businesses and volunteers joined in. It became more than just a repair initiative. Evelyn adored her grandma Ava, often running to greet her with a hug whenever she arrived. Ava's connection to the Carter family reignited something in her that she hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. For decades, her wealth had created a chasm between her and others, but now she felt a renewed purpose. She began to see her fortune not as a source of isolation, but as a tool to create meaningful change. Ava made the decision to donate large portions of her wealth to the city she had once built her empire in. She funded scholarships for underprivileged students, supported local businesses, and established grants for single parents struggling to make ends meet. She worked quietly, often anonymously, her focus always on the impact rather than the recognition. One of her most significant contributions was the creation of a community center in the neighborhood where William's outreach program had taken root. Named the Bennett Carter Community Center, it became a hub for resources, education, and support for families in need. Ava worked closely with William to ensure the center's programs reflected the values they both held dear: kindness, integrity, and the power of second chances. The sun was setting over the city, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood as families gathered for the grand opening of the Bennett Carter Community Center. The atmosphere was alive with joy and anticipation, a hum of energy rippling through the crowd. Children raced across the freshly painted playground, their laughter mingling with the soft notes of a local band playing in the background. Volunteers moved among the gathering with trays of refreshments, homemade cookies, lemonade, and hot coffee, offering smiles and words of welcome to everyone they met. Near the entrance, a stage stood as the centerpiece of the event, framed by garlands of vibrant flowers that swayed gently in the evening breeze. Above the stage hung a banner in bold, hopeful letters: "Together, we build." Its simple message captured the essence of the night: a celebration of unity, resilience, and the power of community. Off to the side, William stood awkwardly, adjusting his tie for the 100th time. It was a new tie, a gift from Ava, and though he appreciated the gesture, he felt slightly out of place wearing it. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, and the idea of standing in front of so many people made his palms sweat. He glanced down at Evelyn, who stood beside him, clutching his hand with the same quiet confidence that had carried him through some of the darkest moments of his life. "You'll do great, Dad," Evelyn said, her voice bright and reassuring. She looked up at him with a smile so full of pride and love that it almost brought tears to his eyes. William chuckled softly, ruffling her hair. "Thanks, kiddo. I hope so." As the crowd began to settle, Ava stepped onto the stage. She moved with a quiet grace that immediately drew everyone's attention, her presence both commanding and approachable. Dressed simply but elegantly, she stood at the podium, her hands resting lightly on its edges. She took a moment to scan the faces in the crowd: parents holding their children, neighbors chatting quietly, and volunteers who had worked tirelessly to bring the center to life. For a brief moment, Ava's gaze softened, her expression touched with gratitude and humility. She let the energy of the moment wash over her, and then she began to speak. "Thank you for being here," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. The microphone carried her words clearly, yet they felt personal, as if she were speaking to each person individually. "Many of you know me as Ava Bennett, a name that has been associated with buildings, businesses, and yes, wealth. But tonight, I want you to know me as something else, someone who has been changed by kindness." The crowd leaned in, captivated by the sincerity in her tone. "Ah." Ava paused, her eyes finding William and Evelyn in the front row. She smiled faintly, as if drawing strength from their presence. "Years ago," she continued, "I believed that success was the key to happiness. I built my life around it, convinced that achieving more, owning more, and earning more would fill the void inside me. But I was wrong. True wealth isn't measured by what you have. It's measured by how much you give." And it was William Carter, a man who had every reason to turn away, who reminded me of that. Ava's words hung in the air for a moment, resonating deeply with the audience. Then the crowd erupted into applause, a wave of appreciation and admiration that seemed to echo across the neighborhood. Ava turned slightly and extended her hand toward William, beckoning him to join her on stage. For a moment he hesitated, his nerves threatening to get the better of him. But Evelyn squeezed his hand, her voice soft but firm. "Go on, Dad." The crowd quieted as William stepped forward, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I wouldn't be here without Ava," he began, his words heartfelt and deliberate. "Her generosity gave me and Evelyn a second chance, one I never thought we'd have. And now we're paying it forward, because no one should have to face life's challenges alone." His gaze shifted to the crowd, his voice gaining strength. "This center is more than just a building, it's a promise that will stand together, support each other, and never stop believing in the power of kindness. As he finished, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause once more. Evelyn, unable to contain her excitement, darted onto the stage and wrapped her arms around both William and Ava. The three of them stood together, a picture of unity and hope, as the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. The setting sun bathed the scene in a warm, golden light, a fitting backdrop for the evening's celebration. In that moment, the Bennett Carter Community Center wasn't just a symbol of second chances, it was a testament to the extraordinary impact of ordinary kindness. As the evening wound down and families began heading home, Ava, William, and Evelyn sat on a bench overlooking the playground. The laughter of children filled the air as the city lights flickered on in the distance. "Thank you," William said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Or everything." Ava smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You've already thanked me, William. Just promise me you'll keep paying it forward." He nodded, his gaze drifting to Evelyn, who was now playing with a group of children nearby. "We will," he said. "Together." True wealth isn't measured by what you have, it's measured by how much you give. What would you do if kindness gave you a second chance at life? Would you embrace it with open arms, or would you let pride hold you back? Have you ever helped someone, not knowing how much it would mean to them? A simple act of kindness, a moment of selflessness. It might seem small to you, but to someone else it could change everything. It could be the difference between despair and hope, between giving up and pushing forward. Kindness doesn't require wealth. It doesn't demand perfection. It only asks that we care. That we see each other not as strangers, but as people, worthy of love and compassion. William didn't have much, but what he had, he gave freely. And in doing so, he unlocked a chain of events that changed his life, Ava's life, and the lives of everyone here tonight. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to echo through generations. What legacy will you leave behind? What impact will you make in someone's life today? If this story inspired you, take a moment to reflect on how you can bring kindness into someone else's life. Maybe it's offering a helping hand, a listening ear, or simply showing someone that they matter. You never know the ripple effect your actions can have. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a little hope. Like, comment, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales, because the world could always use a little more kindness.